Good morning and good afternoon, wherever everyone is tuning in from. We have guests from all over the world today, so thank you for joining us. And today is the fourth and final in our PPP Webinar Series, and we'll be talking about project delivery and operational obligations. And before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to run through a few quick housekeeping points. We'll be recording today's webinar and sharing it afterwards on the Cundall YouTube channel. And also please do submit your questions throughout the next hour, and we'll have some time to answer them at the end. And so I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. So first of all, we have Catherine Workman. Catherine is a partner and head of the Middle East region for law firm Pinsent Masons. Catherine is an expert in PPP projects, having worked in this field since 1995, and she has advised all stakeholders on projects including governments, sponsors and lenders on a variety of projects across Europe, the Middle East and Africa. So welcome, Catherine. And secondly, we have Yvonne Mompeyson, who's the head of strategic development for NG Solutions, covering the Middle East. Yvonne has nearly 20 years of experience in development, funding and operations of energy efficient street lighting and buildings, renewable power supply, green transportation and smart utilities for public authorities and businesses.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Thirdly, we have Jim Lambrianidis, the project director for Plenary Group in Australia, a private sector business specialising in design, construction and FM services delivery aspects of PPP projects. Jim has over 25 years of experience with both government in the development of tender documentation for PPP projects, as well as extensive private sector expertise in the successful bidding and development of PPP projects. Welcome, Jim. And our fourth panelist is Cayman McCabe. Cayman is a principal sustainability consultant at Stantec. And so over his 30 years of consulting experience, Cayman has gained extensive PPP experience, both as a technical advisor and as well as part of a bids consortia. And then finally, our moderator today is Richard Stratton, a partner and managing director of MENA at Cundall. In his 27 years at Cundall, Richard has gained extensive PPP experience, primarily in the healthcare sector. So Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. And firstly, thanks to our panelists for joining, and thank you for everybody in the audience who's joined. We're sharing a screen, myself and Alabelle, for our first technical challenge of the morning, but I think we hopefully got over it. It's the final in our series, so it's been a very interesting journey to hear. Today, we're sort of focusing on the area around project delivery and operational obligations of PPP, essentially the last stage of the project, albeit from this point onwards, there's usually about 25 to 30 years to go for some people. So the journey's nowhere near finished. So I'll launch straight into some questions for our panelists. And if you have any questions from our audience group, wherever you are, just message them in and we'll try and deal with the questions as we go. Jim, I think the first one I was going to sort of direct towards you, which was in the context of a PPP and the complexity, as we know or have discussed in previous panel discussions. How is change managed during the construction stage?
Thanks, Richard. Change is pretty much always happening, even in the PPP, when we think it's probably set in concrete from day one. Change is always happening in a PPP project. Initially, I think it comes through the design development phase of the project, where the design has been literally developed early in concept form, and then as we go through the user group process, change is pretty much occurring all the time. What we have is a process whereby as we're developing the design, changes occur. Now those changes might be for the better, but also they might be from a point of view from a project code where they need a departure because what they thought they could provide during the bid phase is not possible through design. And so there's a number of departures potentially that could be sought as part of that process. Now, those departures are either good in the sense that we seek some sort of maybe compensation from government, or bad in the sense that we've undercooked our bid proposal, and therefore the government's asking for money back in terms of those solutions. The other way change occurs is through the change process that government can either increase or decrease scope, and that comes through the project agreement, and the process is pretty much defined in terms of how that plays out through the change compensation principles in terms of government either seeking to actually add to the project or subtract from the project. So change is always occurring, and it's it can either cost project co or compensate project co depending on how that change occurs. I'm sure Catherine has got some further insights from a legal perspective how that actually occurs.
I was just going to ask you, Catherine, tell us all about the legal minefield that this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it is a mine, as Jim was saying. It is controlled through the contract, and there are quite a lot of considerations to think about when you look at that. For example, if the authority does request a change during the construction period, quite often that's well, apart from highly irritating, needs to be managed in looking at what impact that has on the construction timetable, on the costs. So sometimes the contracts anticipate some rights to refuse or to reject an authority change on the basis that it comes too late in the construction period to be accommodated within the overall programme, because obviously in this scenario the construction period can move, but actually if you've got the entire length of the concession, if you're moving that construction period, it starts to eat into the next period, which is why there are liquidated damages in other scenarios if that's a default. So you don't want to be eating into that service period unless you then extend the back end as well through the change protocol. So you look at whether or not you accommodate those. You also look to see if this has come as a result of a change in law. Sometimes you have to say, look, I have to accommodate this change because the law has changed, and then looking at how you go through those. So there's lots of different variables for change and how you manage those. Then there is the financial consequences of what that means. So as Jim was saying, if you look at it's not necessarily a like for like, because the impact of a change during construction will have an impact upon the term, the debt repayment, on operational costs potentially, and Yvonne, I'm sure I'll have a view about that too, is how that then feeds through. And there's often another contractual provision of financial adjustments protocol that tries to put the parties in the position they would have been had the change not occurred. So it's not, this is a capex change of X and therefore you get paid X. It's likely to be paid Y, and that will have many different implications. So there is definitely a lot to think about if there are changes during the construction phase. I could go on and on, but I won't.
No, it's insightful, because I think there's it is a PPPs are complex projects, you know, maybe in some ways a complex way of delivering projects from a legal perspective. So it's interesting to look at that perspective. So in just one final strand on that one, then maybe Jim or Catherine or anybody else who wants to add to it. Given that PPP in various countries and various forms has been around for such a long time, do you think the legal frameworks are robust enough in the documentation to deal with change?
Very good question. I kind of think so, but until you work your way through it, lawyers like to provide for every eventuality and try and work your way through it. But inevitably, you probably are going to come across things that don't fit in, you know, the square peg and the round hole scenario. They should be flexible enough. I think you're right. So you triggered another thought in my mind. You know, different jurisdictions will treat change differently, and particularly those projects being done in the EU. For example, a change, the EU rules kind of require you to do a new procurement if the change is so significant that it wouldn't have been fair to the market, that had that change been included originally, different people might have bid. So there are those types of considerations that are outside the contract that may dictate how the changes are dealt with, because in those instances, even if everybody wants to do it, you may not be able to, because somebody could come along and challenge it. So even if you've got the best contract in the world, there may be other things around it that could influence how that change is managed. But sorry, Jim, I jumped in before you.
That's fine. I think it's right. I think you're right, Catherine, in terms of the changes are fairly much a case-by-case basis. And here in Australia, we have, as part of the change compensation principles, the capability where the project co has the capability of pricing a change, and then the state government or the authority then has the ability to either accept it. If it accepts it, it's fine, but they might not accept the quoted price, but still force project co to actually deliver the change. And so that becomes an issue in terms of how that then is financed through that, you know, how that comes through the wash in terms of the finance, the equity outcome, and a whole range of other elements with regard to time, as Catherine mentioned before.
Right. Okay, before I jump on to that next question, I was just going to emphasise the third P stands for partnership. So I guess once everybody keeps that in mind, it should hopefully channel the direction. So kind of in this stage of a PPP now, we're really into, you know, the operations, the life of it. You know, it's designed, it's largely built. So what dictates the length of a PPP contract or the concession period? And Catherine, I was going to ask you to sort of lead with that one, and if you've got any thoughts on it, jump in, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are quite a lot to think about at a base level, and certainly early days of projects. The length of the contract or the concession is largely dictated by the level of investment that's put into it. So to ensure that there's enough time to recover that investment, and certainly in the early days of PFI in the UK, interestingly, the first couple of projects started at around 15 years, but then everybody realised, a bit like a mortgage that you have with your own property, that if you extend the term out a bit longer, the availability payments will be a bit smaller each time. So certainly in early days in the UK, the tenor then started getting to around between 20 and 30 years, because that then reduced the amount that they were paying each month on an availability basis. But there are a couple of other things that may dictate. In some jurisdictions, the PPP law says probably the maximum that a concession period could be. And some of those around land and are dictated to by land rights and land ownership. So, for example, in Kuwait, you can't hold land for too long as a foreign investor, and that will dictate the length of the concession, and then the PPP laws do it. And I think the real estate angle is also quite interesting if you do have a project that has some mixed use development, which funders don't like funding, but if it is included in the project, then hotels need a minimum of 50 years before they can they break even, or so they say. So there are a number of things that will dictate it, but at a base level, it will be what's needed to make the return on the investment that's put in. But I don't know if that's everybody else's experience.
Yeah, I think, Catherine, I think that's right. We had early on in our projects here, we as part of a privatisation approach, our first project went to 20 years. Our second project, we tested the market down to 15 years. Third project, we thought we could test the market even further, 10 years. It was just not viable for the market to accept a 10-year tenure in terms of what the requirement was to pay the debt. So I think our lowest is 15 years, highest is 25. Project in Canada that I worked on, they had an affordability threshold, which they had to try and achieve. And the term was 25 years. And they were having a problem trying to get that in terms of the QSP or the monthly payment. So I just said to them, well, why don't you make it over 30 years? And lo and behold, they met the affordability threshold. And so you're right, everything you've said is correct in terms of it's either in terms of government looking at affordability thresholds, in terms of investors' returns, or looking at land tenure arrangements in terms of how they pan out with regard to leasehold land and whether or not what time frame those leasehold holdings can apply in terms of the minimum aspect before you can actually or the project just can't go ahead.
Interesting. So putting that in perspective then, so again, I'm not sure of our audience's experience on this, but from what you're just saying, we're talking about contract periods of typically anything between say 15 and 30 years, which is a long time. If I was going to ask you, in the context of that, both from a private sector and a public sector perspective, what do you think the key risks are then during the operational period?
Thank you. Key risk, like we said, we're talking about very, very long operation period. We're talking about stakeholders with very different profiles and objectives. There's perhaps two categories of risks. The first one would be internal to the PPP, okay, to the PPP structure, so internal to the parties and to the structure put in place. The first one we're really focused on is performance of the equipment and the personnel. Once operations are launched, it's how much performance, how much can we ensure that the equipment has been installed, the systems, the software are being delivering as per expected. How much personnel is available to recruit and then is trained and is operational. How we manage performance of the personnel, how we manage turnover, how we manage supervision. This is as far as I was concerned, particularly in emerging markets, this is a key risk. There's another risk that is normally supposed to be covered prior to financial close and construction is payment risk from both sides, payment from the concession authority to the PPP holder, let's say, and also payments of any sort of penalties or any sort of other payments from the PPP sponsor to third parties or to the concession authority. That's internal. External risks would be the price for the long-term, price risk we take on spare parts and other equipments to manage the life cycle of the assets. We mentioned earlier change in law, change in tax, force majeure, key risks during operations. Everything should have been catered for in the contracts. However, when they happen in real time, sometimes the discussion can take a different turn. There's also sometimes we're confronted with technology risk, technology changes, standards changes, not necessarily to laws, but authorities want to get the latest technology for such and such operations. I'm thinking about healthcare, notably, and that's something we need to take into account in our budgeting and in our operations planning.
So I think that's a good point in terms of, we spoke about change earlier, but change we just spoke about through construction, but there's also change actually occurs through operations as well, which has a significant impact to sometimes looking at from either a healthcare project, education project, where we have redundancy aspects that's included in the project and spare capacities, which are then taken up through change and expansion capabilities, which then has an impact in terms of life cycle and some of the capability of meeting the KPIs as well. So it does become over that 30-year period or 25-year period, change will occur, expansion will occur, and how that expansion then comes into the operations and impacts the operations is quite significant.
Yeah, there's also in the building tuning phase, or the early phase where you're basically handing it over operationally, is making sure that there's a true understanding of what are all the performance factors that need to be delivered, because that is essentially the testing point of that, when effectively that performance is validated, and there's risks there in terms of just people's understanding of what to expect can potentially be slightly different, and you can get some, as you said earlier, Richard, the idea of partnership discussions that has to go along as to where those actual performance characteristics lie.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that point, Cayman, is using that terminology again, partnerships, because it is meant to be a partnership between the public sector and the private sector. How is that risk? So given that we know there's risk, there's always risk, but in the context of a lengthy contract period or concession period, how is risk transfer addressed? I mean, again, Catherine, it's probably more of ends up being a legal jurisdiction, let's call it that. But I mean, what are your thoughts on how risk transfer is addressed?
Yeah, I mean, it does end up, well, obviously the contract is the embodiment of the risk transfer, but we do need to start early days with risk apportionment, risk assessment. So one hopes that the public authorities, before they embark upon on a project, do an assessment of the level of risks. And at that point, they need to determine where those risks can lie. And it's normally, there's a trite saying that, in these types of projects, risks are transferred to the parties best able to manage it. Now, that should not mean that all risks are passed to the private sector, because that would be a jolly good thing to do. And it isn't clever, and I know on previous ones I'm about to hammer home a point that does irritate me, is that kind of approach, because it seemed to be very clever just to pass all of the risk. And the reason it's not very clever for two reasons. One, the private sector cannot take all risk, and they shouldn't necessarily. But also, risk transfer does cost money, and it is not value for money to be passing all risks over. And especially where you've got a risk that is, even though it's a high risk, it may be a low probability. So at that point, it's possibly never going to happen. But if it did happen, it would be catastrophic. But why would you pass that to a private sector to then price that risk with a low probability? So a proper risk apportionment and allocation is needed, and it is to the best able to manage. So those ones that maybe are high risk, low probability, it probably is manageable more by the public sector than the private sector, because if it's got a low probability of happening, then it may be better. So it is looking at that statement and just making sure that risks are, some are obvious, and there are some risks that is the benefit of PPP, is passing those risks over to the private sector, the delivery on time, the delivery to specifications, delivery, quality delivery. Those are all things that are within the capability and scope of the private sector, but there are just some that need to stay behind.
Interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry.
Go for it, Yvonne. Yeah, I was saying I was probably being very unnecessarily harsh.
It's all about who's, like you said, who's the best place to take the risk. And normally we're in the delivery and obligation and operations phase of those webinars, but I think it should be mostly covered within the contractual negotiation stage, and each party needs to know extremely well what are their skills, what they're good at, and what they want to transfer to the other party, and that's the philosophy according to which the contract should be drafted. And there might be risks that are not foreseen. It might happen despite all the industry experience that we all have. And in there, it's really about knowing the capabilities of each other, knowing how could we best manage the risk in the interest of the project and of the parties, and keeping a dialogue on that. But it's very much a contractual exercise, I would say.
Yeah. And to kind of, I suppose, to put, not meaning to put a negative spin on it, but just to put it in perspective, let's put it like that. I think all of us have been involved in PPP through its evolution and have probably seen the best and worst of it. But the entity that actually delivers the project, whether it's called Project Co or the special purpose vehicle, in the context of a scenario where too much risk is transferred, say, to the private sector. And I'm going to direct this at Cayman because he may be, I think, the only person on the panel that's actually experienced this scenario. But what happens if the private sector, the special purpose vehicle, what happens if they go bankrupt?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have that experience where, although I was as a consultant on the project, the issue here really related to so the partnership that actually makes up the Project Co, which in this instance was the builder, made the unfortunate mistake to believe that a PPP was in fact a design and construct, which is unfortunately was a fatal flaw for them, because effectively they weren't getting the sign off for the documentation to allow them to proceed to release the funds as the project proceeded, and in effect ran out of money, and that basically caused the Project Co and the SPV to fall over in that instance. Now there was a number of protections there. There are bank guarantees in place, multi-million-dollar bonds that were there. They all came to the table, and unfortunately were all used up in allowing that to happen. So the government in that instance, yes, they paid their price, but they didn't pay the full price for that issue. There was protections there. The project still proceeded. The actual banks stepped in and financed the delivery of the project, because ultimately they were taking the full, the final, I suppose, check of paying for that. The project was delayed, unfortunately, so it didn't get delivered in the desired time frame from a political perspective, but did get delivered. There was a lot of negotiations, discussions, and in some cases, certain entities and consultants decided to walk away and cut their losses from proceeding. But we stayed on the project, and it was ultimately delivered. The state got what they ultimately asked for. It just cost effectively the banks more to actually finance it than they originally had allowed for. So it's about actually just making sure that the protections are there. And I think it's very important that everybody understands what a PPP is in terms of how it actually works. Having worked as a technical advisor as well as a consultant for delivery, it's really important that both parties understand that. And it's very much as words have been used before in terms of a partnership. It's working together to deliver, and also managing the risks appropriately.
I guess there's the softer side of that maybe doesn't get valued. I mean, you mentioned it there, Cayman. The project was severely delayed, or perhaps the project was derailed so much that it had to create a completely new procurement process. But PPP, the sorts of projects it's applied to are generally very important public services. Whether it be healthcare, whether it be infrastructure. There's an impact to the wider community of these projects not proceeding, which I guess often isn't valued.
Absolutely. I mean, this particular project was a correctional facility, so it put a lot more pressure on other existing facilities in the state, and it basically has the political pain that had to be carried for not delivering, and oppositions love tackling governments in power to highlight their deficiencies, even though it wasn't necessarily theirs. But at the end of the day, the project was ultimately delivered, and the costs to state were managed and minimized because of the nature of how things were set up from a bond perspective and a financial protection perspective, because the banks couldn't walk away. Ultimately, they had to actually stand by their commitments.
Interesting. And in terms of we've got to the point now where hopefully everything's solid, change is managed, the project is going smoothly as a partnership, which is what we all hope. At the end of this this concession period, this 15 years to say 30-year period, what does the public sector actually get at the end of that period? And Yvonne, I was going to sort of ask you this one. There's something, an asset has been created and the contract is over. What do the public sector get?
Well, hopefully, typically they get an operating asset. We were mentioning several criteria in determining the length of a PPP. I think one of the key criteria is the technical life of the asset. Typically, the length of a PPP should be shorter than the typical technical life. Yeah, and so in order to leave the authority an asset that still has a substantial expected useful life, despite having managed the life cycle of these assets and having maintained it properly. But yes, typically there should be a smooth transition. The asset's operating, it's been properly maintained by the PPP holder, and either for free or for a fee, depending on the contract. That's the same asset that the government is taking over. In some cases, there are obligations to hand over the asset within certain performance standards and certain technological standards as well, I should say. It should be as per the latest progress or techniques. And it should have a minimum of remaining operating life or such. Sometimes the PPP holder can provide certain guarantees. I haven't seen that often, but I've seen that in a few cases where there's some operating guarantees, equipment guarantees, either from OEMs or from the PPP sponsor itself. And the team as well. In many cases, the team is transferred, and the team is supposed to be trained and experienced at operating these assets. So normally it should be quite fairly smooth and continuous.
And I think, Jim, I was going to direct this one at you, because something Yvonne was saying there just made me think about this. If you were to sort of benchmark, and maybe this is an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. But if you were to benchmark the asset, what's your thoughts around, say, traditionally procured asset, a building or whatever it may be, infrastructure that ends up being 30 years old and is in a certain condition, and then you get something that goes through a PPP process? I mean, do you think the quality of what the public sector gets handed back is better quality, better value for the public sector?
Yeah, Richard, I think that's right. I think the value they get from a PPP, because all the life cycle maintenance costs are embedded in the actual PPP process, and there's also the KPI regime that ensures that the asset is maintained to a higher standard and quality. What we find with public sector assets, they're provided capex, but limited in terms of the opex, in terms of what they get on an annualized basis compared to a PPP. So at the end of a PPP concession, also there are handback conditions in terms of the requirements of, as Yvonne basically said, there's conditional requirements for plant, equipment, useful life of other elements within the building that the private sector need to adhere to. So what happens typically 5 years out, there's a number of surveys that are done 12 months out as well, and there's a whole range of elements that are either need to be fixed, upgraded, or whatever. And part of that handback condition is that the government requires that they have almost a maintenance-free, or maintenance, but the major plant-free changeovers for the 5 years post handover. And so there's almost a risk-free period post handover of the asset. So therefore, the condition has to be in a superior quality to actually achieve that handback condition. And I think most of the FM providers, when they're looking at the life cycle replacement, basically look at how many life cycle changes they need to implement through the concession period, but then also that impacts on the handback as well. So there is that capability of making sure that the maintenance and the life cycle are kept up because of the KPI regime, where that's not the case in a public asset.
Yeah, and and the contract, largely in addition to the KPI regime, does have a handback regime as well. So just before, 2 years before the end of the concession period, an entire survey is done of the assets to ensure that it does comply with the maintenance. So even though there's been ongoing check, there is a kind of a 2 year before the end check, double check, and an amount set aside. There's even a handback bond often required just to set aside that. Now that 2 year period I was having this conversation with a lender this morning on a school project, and I was like, why are you worried about handback? You should be well gone. He said, well, yes, maybe the soft mini pen. He said, but maybe if not. And I said, well, actually the origin of this 25 or so years ago was the 2 year period was largely picked right at the end, when lenders really should have gone, even when in the olden days when we had long-term debt requirements, you still because the sponsors will look for it, because this is when they get the whole entire availability payment without any debt requirements, and this is where they get their slightly bigger windfall towards the end, hopefully. But the handbacks needs to be done, so putting in place a handback bond to ensure that those assets really are on the handover at the total shape they should be is covered. So I agree with Jim and Yvonne that, you know, the asset is in the best position it should be at the end of the term.
Okay. And Cayman, I was going to pick up, I should have said it before we got to the very end of the concession period, because I was thinking of the sort of the end of the construction period, and you mentioned a tuning process and a tuning period. I mean, I suppose, firstly, can you kind of explain what the tuning process and the tuning period is, and how long you think that should be, if we're really trying to make sure that the built asset, whatever it is, performs to the target set out in the original PPP contract?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit like this was the length of the actual the contract itself. The time frame that's now being adopted on PPPs has got longer. Initially, that was around 2 years, and then it's now moved to 3. And it's essentially about ensuring that when a system is designed or a building is designed, there's a whole bunch of design parameters that are adopted. There are operational assumptions that are made as to how things will actually be used. Now, they are assumptions. The reality of it is buildings get used differently than potentially they might be initially assumed to be. Circumstances can change. Usage patterns can change, where you know, facilities are used a lot more for longer hours or for more concentrated periods, and therefore the building needs to actually tune itself and get in tune with how the building is actually being used. So that's largely what it is. It's about having the building understand, or better understand, how the building is actually being used, or the facility is actually being used. And it allows things to be tweaked and modified, and just like you have your car, you should be getting your car tuned every year, because it goes out of whack. Traditionally, in traditional procurement, you've got what they call a 12 months defects liability period, and that should, but invariably wasn't being used to actually properly tune the building or the facility. And in the PPP process, they've basically recognized that that's really important, particularly with a large asset, to make sure it is delivering as it should. Giving yourself 2 or now 3 years gives you that ability to look at things seasonally. So when you're going to 2 or 3 winters or 2 or 3 summers, so you can actually start to really get to understand how the building is actually operating. And you can also test whether the performance requirements that you've set are actually being met. And it gives both parties, through engagement and participation, to actually work together to ensure that the building or facility is actually delivering, both from a performance perspective and an operational expectation perspective, as it should be.
And from that perspective, I mean, I've seen this done in a number of ways, but it's, as you say, Cayman, you're dealing with a whole bunch of variables and assumptions in the first instance, and within that within that tuning period, I think there are mechanisms quite often implemented in the contract that allows the performance requirements to be adjusted based on the tuning period. I mean, is that correct? I mean, Catherine, are you seeing that?
Well, in terms of targets?
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's at the end of the day, as Jim and I would know, basically you have to try and, to a certain degree, establish what you believe is an operational baseline, and what are the operational profiles that you need to use. Increasingly, PPPs are telling you have to meet a greenhouse intensity target or a water operational target, and you have to make operational assumptions on those. And simple things can be a case of climate. You might have a particularly hot year that is the first year out from when you've delivered, and how do you manage that? And that's part of why you're basically having to look at those and work through that design and delivery phase, explaining that to the state or the procurer as to the assumptions that you made. So there's an understanding of that. So when something different happens, the parties can both understand, okay, we had assumed, because the way you briefed it, potentially that this part of the building will be used 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Now, the reality of it is, unfortunately, like we've had in the last 2 years with COVID, facilities have started to be used 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And that completely changes the assumptions that have to be made. So it's working through that. And that's what I suppose the tuning period gives you, and also during the operational point, mechanisms by which you actually can reset things and adapt to the change that's there. But yes, ultimately, at the end of that tuning period, whether it's 2 or 3 years, you have fixed performance requirements that are set out, which are expected to be achieved for the duration of the contract period, subject to obviously accounting for change.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Just in relation to that point about, working with the authority, and I'm sure Yvonne's been on the end of this, is there are some types of projects where the design is forced upon the private sector. It's very common in the airport sector, for example. Most people governments like to design their own airports, and then they hand the design over to the private sector and say, there you go. And often isn't the easiest way, because they've gone off and got these a new phrase I heard recently, a star architect to design this flagship thing. And I've been aware, for example, in some Middle East ones, there was a project where the airport was built, was highly full of glass, which considering it was in a very hot country, not helpful. So the air conditioning bill went up, and also that glass needed constant cleaning. So from an operational perspective, wasn't helpful either. And so there's often quite a lot of work that's needed. You don't just go off and hand a design over and do it, that you need that fine tuning as well during that process too.
Yeah, and the building tuning is, in our experience, there's the, let's call it the formal building tuning at the handover stage, start of operations. Typically, like we said, like we heard, 1 or 2 years, depending on seasonality. But in our experience, it's a continuous process where we identify opportunities for enhancement of performance, energy efficiency, comfort, operating conditions, and we see that in majority of buildings, but also other types of assets such as street lights or power plants or the likes.
Yeah, that was going to be a question I was going to ask. Was around, given what you were saying there, Cayman, as well, and Yvonne, what you just said is, what sort of strategies can we consider for the ongoing optimal performance of these assets, given that, I think you mentioned it, Cayman, that what it was originally designed for and how it's used, and COVID has shown this, may very well vary during the operations period.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Yvonne said is very important, is that building tuning doesn't stop after that 2 or 3 year period. It is a continuous thing, and it's a very important thing. And there tends to be expectations and benefits that parties can get if you beat a performance outcome during the rest of the term. But I think really, in terms of making sure that I suppose the building starts off as best as it can, it's back to that word partnership. You have to engage with each other. You have to work with the authority, as well as to understanding as best as you can how the building is expected to be used, and that the assumptions that you're making in determining what your predicted energy use is, or greenhouse gas emissions may be, or your water consumption is, or the amount of the operating cost of things as well, And some of that's actually preset. So in other words, the brief that you actually originally get sets out, I suppose, a starting point for that discussion. The bid is based on that. And the bid basically says, based on what you've told us is going to be used or the detail you've given us, this is what we believe the performance outcome be achieved. But then as you move through the design and the delivery phase, more detail occurs, more information occurs, and you need to be able to capture that and engage with, have both parties engaged, so that when you get to that end point, it may actually be a slightly reset that actually has to be there. Now, you obviously need to make sure you're still contractually not changing the rules, but you actually do need to actually work that through. And a particular example of that would be, and this is where the partnership becomes really important, is in a hospital, 45 to 50% of the energy consumption is actually the plug-in loads. The bidders are basically just establishing an energy budget to meet a target, or a greenhouse target, and they had to make assumptions on the uses of things based on the briefing documents they've got. You can't turn around and say, well, the energy budget that we had was the MRI machine was going to be used twice a week, not 3 times a week. So you've used your 2 times, you can't use it till next week. It doesn't work that way. So it has to become a partnership where both parties understand that achieving a performance outcome isn't just one person doing something, it's actually everybody working together to achieve it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that goes back to Catherine's point about risk and who's able to manage that risk. In Australia, probably about 10 years ago, governments were pushing in terms of the private sector to take utility risk. And to your point, Cayman, we're not, we can only push the barrow so far in terms of either building tuning or doing whatever we need to do to actually manage utilities, but we're not actually in the facility, operating the facility on a day-to-day basis. So when the users leave the taps on or leave the lights on, that has an impact in terms of the energy or the utility consumption. And from a risk perspective, that's one thing that we just cannot control as to how those users operate.
Yeah, I'd be interesting to see some of the PPPs from a water use perspective, particularly hospitals during the last 2 years. I suspect few, if any, have actually met their targets because of the massive amount of increased water use.
Right, yeah.
And I think, well, probably final question, and Cayman, I think you used the term achieving a performance outcome, or say life cycle management. Sort of starting with you, Yvonne, I was going to, and everybody else, please chip in. I mean, are there any kind of key lessons learned from PPPs you've done to date that you would like to share?
I think we touched on a very critical point, is understanding the intent, the operating regime that the client or the authority has in mind. It's not all defined in the RFP, it's not all defined in documents, and the example of the MRI was quite a good one, where we need to understand how the asset is going to be used, how the authority is going to behave, how the users are going to behave, and plan accordingly in terms of technology selection, in terms of maintenance schedules, in terms of maintenance budgeting. The sinking fund, it's particularly in this region in Middle East, it's too often forgotten, depending on the type of PPP you're looking at. So for us, preparation is key, and not only having the perfect bid as per the RFP, but having the right understanding of the spirit of the intent of the use of the asset and how we can plan for that. And that goes through engaging into very close discussions with the authority, knowing operating regime of such and such type of assets, knowing how people use them. We're talking about users, there could be patients, there could be doctors, teachers, there could be anything. Measurement is extremely important. measure what matters, data collection management that tells you how the life cycle is managed. That tells you how the equipment is performing and is potentially about to fail, or the type of usage that create failure. That's for us extremely important. And then how to process the data that has been collected and how to very effectively act on it. And of course, the last one I would think would be sharing information. Share best practices, retain your team, because they build up the knowledge of the asset, of the client, of the usage, and all that feeds into this data management system, let's speak, or approach that we think is paramount for better lifecycle management, better performance.
It sparked another question in me, Yvonne, and I'm not sure we have time, but I'll ask it anyway, because it might anybody else who wants to chip in on this. But something you said, and I think you said it as well, Jim, was that when you take an asset and the use of it, and I'll use a hospital as an example because it's probably an easier one for everybody to digest, but you've got staff using the facility, patients using the facility, and the way in which they use the facility has a huge impact on the performance, whether it be energy, whether it be water usage. How can we make staff and customers, let's call them customers for the wide range of assets, part of the partnership?
That's a good question. In terms of when you're looking at utility usage, there is the capability of looking at usage, utilisation in terms of spread around the hospital, providing staff and consumers in terms of energy consumption, how far they've gone from 1 week or 1 month to the next, and how that performance is going. So those performance indicators of how the building's performing, and giving some ownership to the staff and as well as the patients, provide some sort of approach to try and actually give them some understanding in terms of the issue of either energy usage, issue of how much carbon is being extracted from the site based on savings from previous months, as well as looking at some sort of other education programs. Is probably the best approach you could do. I don't think you could take a punitive approach in terms of that, but also you utilising technology. As technology increases, and the capability of understanding in terms of metering which elements of the building are being used more often than others, and actually drilling down from Yvonne's point, from an FM perspective, understanding how that building is being used in terms of energy, water, gas, and other elements, to try and drill down and actually understand why that's occurring, and is it a staff issue or is it a tuning issue?
I'd also jump in here and say that it's part of its engagement, and it's been touched upon before about retaining of that intelligence that's behind the delivery, and there's probably sometimes not enough actually retention of some of the designers or the actual people who've delivered the project, retaining that knowledge or finding a way of retaining that knowledge, so that as you move through the operational phase, there's a very clear understanding as to what the assumptions were in that phase, so you can make the right decisions from there. But equally, actually making sure that operationally the right people are talking to each other first before the information then gets disseminated down in the best way possible, because Project Code doesn't have the ability to necessarily to actually take the staff to the side and tell them what they need to do. If that would be the authority's role, but they need to work together to actually make sure the information is there to best tune it.
Yeah, and I think to some extent, as we're heading into a huge technology boom in the sense of whether it's your home or buildings or in a hospital, artificial intelligence is having a greater role in terms of how these systems are operating, understanding and learning from from utilisation and actually being able to flag some of these key issues in terms of where consumption items are above benchmark levels and a whole range of things, as well as BMS systems, much smarter BMS systems that will give you a much more attuned building operating environment. I'm not sure.
The whole issue of big data, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
There's a whole other subject there. Okay, well, I think we've reached the end. I wanted to thank everybody that has attended the webinar, and especially our wonderful panelists, Catherine, Yvonne, Jim, and Cayman. And also from our previous webinars, there's Morgan Belcher from Macdonald, Jonathan Stewart from Gleeds, Nick Davis from Broadway Malyon, and Stephen Liddington from Colliers. I've found it incredibly interesting, and I've learned a lot more, and very grateful for everybody's participation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.